This week on Jerusalem Dateline, CBN News sits down for an exclusive interview with U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, about the historic changes in the Middle East.
Look, I think we are at the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Also, Sudan joins the Abraham Club. And what impact will the U.S. elections have on the region? And which way are Israeli Americans leaning? All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. From the Abraham Accords to the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, in the past 4 years, U.S. Ambassador David Friedman has seen historic changes in the Middle East. And in many of those changes, he's been a key player. Friedman sat down for an exclusive interview with CBN News about what's happened and what's next. Ambassador Friedman, great to see you again with CBN News.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be with you.
On November 3rd, Americans are going to really decide the future of America. What's at stake here in Israel, Jerusalem, and the Middle East?
The president has developed a policy for the Middle East that really works. You know, it's pro-Israel, it's pro-allies, it's pro-freedom, pro-freedom of religion, it's pro-growth, and it's really working. You know, as you know, we've done unprecedented things, both bilaterally with Israel and multilaterally with nations like UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. So we're really happy with what we've done. We're very proud of what we've done over the first term. I think if we're honored and blessed with the opportunity to serve our country for a second term, I think we can do even more. I don't want to focus on the dangers of another administration. I think everyone can do that analysis on their own, but I think the opportunity, the upside for a second Trump administration is enormous.
When you look back on the last 4 years, what achievements stand out to you?
You know, I think that moving the embassy to Jerusalem, I think that was really the most important thing the president did, not just because we all believe that Jerusalem's the capital of Israel. It's been the capital of Israel for more than 3,000 years. The Supreme Court, the Knesset, the president's residence, the prime minister's residence are all here. Those, of course, are true, and the United States has the right to put its embassy in the capital of an ally. But it's not just that. It's the message that the move sent to the world, that President Trump stands with his friends, stands on principle, keeps a promise, can be trusted to keep a promise, and will not shirk or shy away, from baseless threats from rogue nations. That was an incredibly powerful message that the president sent, and it resonated throughout the world. And I believe that it set our foreign policy on the right track everywhere. And I think it may seem counterintuitive to people, but we believe this would lead to peace. If you remember, that's what Jared Kushner said when we opened the embassy, it will lead to peace, and it did.
One of the things that's been happening in the last few months is the Abraham Accords on September 15th, and the UAE and Bahrain has been signing more agreements after that. It seems to be coming to a crescendo. President Trump has said maybe 10 nations are in line. What's next, and who's next?
You can pull out a map and come up with some pretty good guesses as to who's next. I think all the regional players are in discussion. I don't want to speak for them or betray any confidences or their sensitivities, but the president is correct. There are 5 to 10 countries that are in active discussions with us. They have everything to gain by joining this circle of peace. They have nothing to lose. If their concern is for the Palestinians, the best thing they can do is to expand this circle of peace, create people-to-people engagement, commercial, cultural, travel. It will open up the region, and I think it will be in the best interest of everyone, including the Palestinians.
Yeah. What about Saudi Arabia? Can you address that? Or?
Look, what I can say about Saudi Arabia, again, I don't speak for them, and I'll let them take their own position at the right time, but they've been incredibly helpful to this process. We now fly from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi in about 3 hours. Without Saudi Arabia, that flight takes about 7 hours. Having flyover rights, any flight from Tel Aviv to an Arab country in the Gulf, the Saudis have said, Israeli airlines, other airlines, free to use our airspace. It's something that people have been asking the Saudis for a generation, because it's not just, for example, a flight from Israel to India would normally fly over Saudi airspace if you were taking the most direct route. It's a big deal. I would allow the process to take its course, and I would be appreciative, I certainly am, and I think our government is, of the steps the Saudis have already taken.
Looking at the impact of the Abraham Accords on the region, what do you see in a year, 2, 5 years? What could change here in the region?
I think we are at the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You know, there's about 22 nations in the Arab League. Right now we have about 5 of them, including Jordan and Egypt, that have normal relations with Israel. Once you get to a certain level, whether it's another 5 or another 7 or 8 or 10, you have what I would say by analogy, you know, on a subject that we're all familiar with now, you have something along the lines of herd immunity. You know, you have so many people that are already on board. The narrative, the old grievances kind of collapses on itself. And I think we're really at the beginning of a very hopeful period in the Middle East.
After a diplomatic and legal battle lasting for years, Ambassador Friedman presented 18-year-old Menachem Zivotofsky with his passport.
It is my honor to present you with the very first passport issued to an American citizen born in Jerusalem, with Israel designated as the place of birth. This is yours.
I'm humbled and honored to receive this passport as a representative of the many American citizens born in Jerusalem who can now have their official government documents reflect the fact that they were born in Israel.
Friedman said both Secretary of State Pompeo and President Trump played decisive roles in allowing American citizens born in Jerusalem to have Israel as their country of origin. Up next, more with Ambassador Friedman about the dangers of Iran and what he calls the Second Abraham Accords. In the second part of our exclusive interview with Ambassador Friedman, he addresses the danger of Iran and how he sees the Abraham Accords through the lens of the Bible. A lot of people would look at one of the achievements would be getting out of the Iranian nuclear deal. Former Vice President Biden and Senator Harris have said that if they're elected, they would renew the Iranian nuclear deal. What impact could that have on Israel and the region?
It would be a disaster. It would be a complete disaster. Iran is a very dangerous country. We have made Iran far less dangerous than they were 4 years ago. We have broken the Iranian economy. We have made it much more difficult, much more expensive for Iran to engage in adventurism and terrorism throughout the crescent of Yemen, of Iraq, of Syria, and of Lebanon. And they're pulling back. They will continue to pull back, I believe, if we keep the sanctions on. The worst thing we can do right now when we have them on the ropes is to let the pressure off. Remember, you know, we've eliminated the greatest individual state sponsor of terrorism, the greatest individual participant in Qasem Soleimani. So we're really on the right track. We're going to prevail. We're going to, I believe, make peace with the Iranian people, who we have no grievance against, who the Israelis have no grievance against, make peace with the Iranian people, and hopefully get the Iranian regime to end its malign influence. And I think when you look at the Abraham Accords and our position on Iran, you see the juxtaposition is important. On the one hand, with the enemies of the United States, with the enemies of peace, with the sponsors of terrorism, our position could not be stronger. Our position is unambiguous, and we provide no quarter, you know, no solace to people who want to engage in state-sponsored terrorism. On the other hand, where we have friends, where we have allies, you know, the sky's the limit for how far we can go. And I think creating that dichotomy, we put the choice to the people. Where do you want to be? You want to be on the side of peace, prosperity, opportunity, or do you want to be on the side of violence and terror and ultimately poverty? That's the choice that I think the Trump administration has created better than anyone else that's preceded us, and that's why I think we're having success.
Earlier today, you were in Ariel, right in the middle of Samaria, and I was watching you on YouTube. You talked about the Pompeo doctrine, about no longer having Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria illegal under international law. What was the significance of your visit and what you signed today? What does that mean for the biblical heartland?
Well, first of all, with regard to choosing Ariel, I mean, we chose the institution that was most aggrieved by the old way of doing business, right? Ariel is a first-class university with 16,000 students. I think about 20% of them are Palestinian. And the United States and Israel are collaborating, but we had this anachronistic rule that we couldn't fund Ariel because of its postal code. So we did away with that today. This is what it means. What it means is that we are moving further and further away, whether it's in our position with Israel and the Palestinians or with Israel and the rest of the countries. We're trying to get away from the old narrative of ancient grievances, of violence, of terror, and say, look, folks, here it is. Here are the opportunities. We can work together collaboratively on science, on technology, on agriculture. Okay? We can do that. We can make our children happier and more prosperous. We can build a better world for our grandchildren. We can go back to just, the old narrative. And this is yet another step in that direction of moving the Middle East towards a position of growth and prosperity and away from these ancient grievances that have never been solved and never resulted in a day of peace.
Is that part of the peace to prosperity and part of the developing business between Israelis and Palestinian businessmen?
Sure, because as Israelis and Palestinians work together more, and they have been. I mean, there are industrial zones where Israelis and Palestinians work together and prosper together. There aren't enough. As that, is given further life, of course, as people, work with each other and prosper together and build things together, the temperature drops dramatically. And then, political issues can get resolved. The biggest mistake that the Palestinian leadership has made, they've made this from day one, and I've taken them to task many times. Their view is no people-to-people engagement, no quality of life improvements until there's a political solution. Where has that left their people? We had a conference in Bahrain before the normalization. We had it about a year ago, I think. There were huge players that were there with some of the biggest checkbooks in the world looking to help. And many countries attended. Palestinians boycotted. This is exactly the wrong path towards peace.
In a little while, you're going to be going to the Knesset. You're going to be speaking on Jerusalem and the Bible. What are you going to be sharing?
I am going to be speaking about the original Abraham Accords. The original Abraham Accords was the reconciliation between Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac was the second son of Abraham. Ishmael was the first. They were rivals. Abraham was very pained by that rivalry. He sent Ishmael away. But then God heard the voice of Ishmael. He made him a father of 12 princes, came from Ishmael. And Isaac and Ishmael reconciled before Abraham passed away. We're doing that again 3,500 years later. And I think that's an appropriate Bible story, Bible lesson for today with the Knesset.
Well, Ambassador Friedman, I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you, Chris. Real pleasure.
Coming up, how will the U.S. election affect Jerusalem, Israel, and the Middle East? Foreign policy did not play a major role in the recent presidential debates, but it remains one of the most important issues facing voters. Israel and the Middle East are now anxiously awaiting to see how the U.S. election will shape the future of the region. From Iran to Saudi Arabia to Israel, the Middle East is looking to November 3rd.
It's a fateful election for the Middle East and Israel. Both former Vice President Biden and the incumbent President Trump have stated what would be their policies for the coming 4 years. And in certain ways, they differ fundamentally, even dramatically.
The main question from Israel is, would a Biden administration re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal known as the JCPOA?
President Obama and his administration viewed the JCPOA as their singular sterling achievement in foreign policy. And they'll, I think, go to a great length to ensure that America returns to that agreement. With respect to Iran, both the former vice president and his running mate, Senator Harris, have said unequivocally that they intend to renew the Iran nuclear deal of 2015. If Iran returns to the levels of uranium enrichment established by that deal, it's not very difficult for Iran to do. And that means lifting sanctions, and that has profound ramifications for Israel and the Middle East.
And what about the Abraham Accords?
I do not think that a possible future Democratic administration will invest in those accords the way the Trump administration has. I don't think they're going to invest money, for example, in building the Israeli-Sudanese peace, because that belongs to the Trump era. And again, the emphasis will be on the Palestinian issue and not on the Abraham Accords.
Israel's former ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, believes a Biden administration would reverse certain Trump policies that benefit his country.
a Biden presidency would return to the policies of both the Obama administration and Clinton administration. We're giving precedence to the achievement of a Palestinian state based on the 67 borders with Jerusalem as its capital, East Jerusalem its capital.
While Election Day approaches, Oren says the region is in a holding pattern.
And I know personally from being in contact with business associates around these areas, everyone's waiting to see what happens with the elections.
Oren says regardless of who wins, Israel will be looking to maintain its traditional close relationship with the U.S. President Trump announced that Sudan and Israel have now normalized relations, the third in a series of Muslim countries making peace with the Jewish state, in what's become known as the Abraham Accords. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
President Trump paved the way for the Sudan-Israel peace deal when he removed Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terrorism.
It's a very special deal. For much of recent history, the people of Sudan were ruled over by brutal Islamic dictatorships. It was the home of Osama bin Laden, a place of terror, genocide, and many other tragedies. Today, great people of Sudan are in charge, and new democracy is taking root.
Trump said the deal would unlock new trade, education, and research opportunities. Although Sudan and Israel don't have a common border, Iran has supplied weapons to Hamas through that African nation. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hailed the deal as another dramatic breakthrough.
What a great change. In Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, they adopted in 1967 the 3 no's of the Arab League: no to peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. But today, Khartoum is saying yes to peace with Israel, yes to recognition of Israel, and yes to normalization with Israel.
As part of the deal, Netanyahu's office announced it would send $5 million worth of wheat immediately to Israel's new friends in Sudan. And that's just the beginning. Trump and Netanyahu both believe that other Muslim and Middle East countries will soon follow, including Saudi Arabia. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Up next, Israeli Americans take a stand on who they'll be voting for, President Trump or former Vice President Biden. According to a recent poll, if Israelis were voting in American elections, a majority would choose President Trump. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl tells us what some say Americans living here in Israel are likely to do.
It was a colorful event as dozens of cars driven from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem displayed support for President Trump.
I love you, Mr. Trump. I love you.
I believe that Donald J. Trump is a hero. He's a hero of our time. It's time to say thanks to this friend.
I came first of all to support President Trump, a big friend of Israel, and I came with these flags to thank him for the peace agreements he will bring to the Middle East.
The convoy passed the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem before stopping at the promenade overlooking the Old City.
It's been a crazy year, but it's also brought us Donald Trump and the American administration and things here in Israel we could only have dreamed of.
Mark Zell heads Republicans Overseas Israel that organized the event.
What we were trying to send here is a message to the millions of people in the United States who love Israel and want to see Israel succeed. And we want to show them that we are thankful for what we've seen in the past 4 years.
Trump supporters credit him with doing more for the state of Israel than any president since Harry Truman recognized the independence of the fledgling state in 1948.
And this is a special plaque that we made to give to President Trump himself in appreciation for everything he has done for the state of Israel and the Jewish people.
Those accomplishments in the Middle East are seen as abandoning the Iran nuclear deal, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the U.S. Embassy here, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and now the regional peace deals between Israel and its Muslim neighbors. Chezi Kugler of Democrats Abroad Israel disagrees.
Let's take the example in particular of Syria. Syria today is an amalgamation of Russian power, Iranian power, Hezbollah, and ISIS. Having a situation like that chaotic situation on the border of Israel with all our enemies encamped there just across our border is one of Israel's security forces' worst nightmares.
Kugler says Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has been a decades-long supporter of Israel and understands security.
Joe Biden was one of the people who was central, really instrumental in the inception, the building, and the expansion of the strategic relationship between Israel and the United States.
With Biden, he said, Israel would have a strong ally in the White House. There are no actual statistics for the number of eligible American voters in Israel, but Zell estimates there are around 300,000. He predicts half will vote, and most of those will vote Republican. There is one area where both sides agree.
We've also seen quite an upsurge in interest in registration and in voting. So the interest obviously is great.
I've been doing this as a volunteer for some 30 years. I've never seen anything like this in terms of outpouring of interest.
According to Zell, even some registered Democrats in Israel vote Republican. But Dr. Ilana Stockman, Vice Chair for Media and Policy for Democrats Abroad Israel, believes American Jews in Israel line up with their fellow Jews in the States.
For sure, Jews in general, American Jews are overwhelmingly pro-Biden. There is a lot of reason to believe that American Jews in Israel are not that different from American Jews in general.
Stockman says her group is concerned about foreign policy.
Having an unstable foreign policy in America is, really scary. Making sure that there is clear foreign policy and that foreign policy is balanced.
A poll conducted for I-24 News found almost 19% of Israelis say they would choose Biden, while 63% choose Trump.
I live in the Golan Heights. The reason that I came here is to say thank you to the president, and I believe 80% from the Israelis, they feel the same thing I feel.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.